The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we pause to thank you for providing us with strength for each day. As you continue to be our help in times of trouble, may our hearts be lifted to you in gratitude. Lord, guide our lawmakers to show their gratitude for your mercies by obeying your precepts as you help them navigate through these challenging times. May their reverence for you provide them with a wisdom that will glorify your name. Keep our senators from deviating from integrity, so that their thoughts, words, and actions will please you. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved and morning business is closed. And under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Alan Davidson of Maryland to be Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information.
Senate.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, last week I spoke on the floor and I reflected on the unthinkable events of January 6, 2021. We all remember when a violent mob attempted to snuff out one of our democracy's most sacred traditions, the peaceful transition of power. That mob's attack on our nation's capital was fueled by the former president's big lie, the utterly false alternate reality that Joe Biden stole the 2020 election through widespread fraud. But the January 6th insurrection, as nightmarish as it was not the only thing that was spawned by the big lie. Inspired by the former president's baseless conspiracy theory, dozens of states have passed new laws suppressing voters and making it easier for partisan officials to overturn the will of their constituents. These have been billed as, quote, election integrity, close quote, or, quote, election security laws, close quote. Even George Orwell would be impressed by these brazen euphemisms. Disenfranchising tens of thousands of minority voters does nothing to improve the integrity of our elections. And empowering partisan actors to disqualify ballots and ignore the popular will actually makes our elections more insecure. A record number of these voter suppression laws are being considered and enacted as we head toward a major midterm election that will shape the direction of our country. Many of these laws would not see the light of day if the Department of Justice still possessed its pre-clearance powers under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. However, the Supreme Court unwisely decided to gut the Justice Department's pre-clearance powers in the Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013. And then adding insult to injury, the Supreme Court toppled another critical pillar of the Voting Rights Act in the 2021 Brnovich decision. What they did was they even further limited the federal government's tools to combat voter suppression. So the green light from our nation's highest court and constant prodding from a man who refuses to accept reality, partisan state actors have breathed new life into the, quote, big lie, close quote. Not by breaking laws as the January 6th mob did, but by making them. Now, I happen to have a bipartisan bill to restore the Justice Department's powers to oversee and prevent states from enacting discriminatory voting laws. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I worked very hard to craft a compromise bill that's garnered Republican support here in the Senate. So there's truly a low point when Republicans recently refused to even allow debate on my bipartisan legislation. Wouldn't even allow debate. Isn't that the whole point of being a senator? To debate and vote on bills? How can you justify telling your constituents that you refuse to even allow debate on a voting rights bill with a 56-year record of bipartisanship? Are we that afraid to simply do our jobs? It bears repeating, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would simply restore and update provisions of the Voting Rights Act that have been overwhelmingly supported by both parties throughout the law's history. The Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized by large bipartisan majorities in Congress 5 times and proudly signed into law by Presidents Nixon, Reagan, and George W. Bush. That's not what you might call a liberal trio of presidents. The most recent Voting Rights Act reauthorization in 2006 was a 98-0 vote here in the Senate. In fact, a number of senators still serving today, both Republican and Democrat, voted to support that legislation, as did I. Now, the compromise bill I've crafted with Senator Murkowski follows the very same blueprint of these other bipartisan efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act. Probably I'm old-fashioned, but it'd be a tragedy if senators have completely sacrificed our sense of common purpose at the altar of partisanship. We used to believe that protecting our right to vote, the very right that gives democracy its name, is bigger than party or politics. We used to believe that a system of self-government, a government of, by, and for the people, is one that's worth preserving for generations to come. And we used to believe, regardless of party, that government exists to serve the will of the people, not the other way around. And I sincerely hope we still believe these things. The only way to prove it, though, is through our actions. I don't know what the next few weeks are going to have in store, but if we have an opportunity to consider the bipartisan John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, I hope that all of us, my Republican friends and Democrats, will at least have the courage of their convictions and allow a vote on it. And if you oppose a bipartisan bill to restore landmark voting rights law, It's had nearly 6 decades of unwavering bipartisan support, didn't have the courage to stand up on the Senate floor and vote against it. I for one, I'll proudly vote yes. All the tweeting and partisan posturing that seems to consume most of our energy these days will quickly be forgotten. What will be remembered for decades is what the Senate did in our democracy's hour of peril. I hope, indeed I pray, that the answer is not nothing. Madam President, too many hide behind parliamentary procedures not to have to vote on anything. What is wrong with us? We get 6-year terms. Don't be afraid to vote. Vote yes or vote no, but stand up and let the people know where you stand and vote. This, well, we're going to block this coming to a vote means I don't have the courage to stand up and vote. That's all it means. You want to stop these things from coming to a vote, it means you don't have the courage to vote. You're not willing to go on record to vote. Or you're afraid somebody might look at your vote someday and say, why did he or she vote that way? Madam President, I've voted more than 17,000 times on this floor. I've been proud to vote them the way I have. I'm sure I could go look back over decades of voting and find a vote here and a vote there and say, you know, maybe I should have voted differently, but these issues always come back up again, and I'll correct my vote. But not if we're not allowed to vote. I had one senator say that the reason we want this kind of open voting is so that we can elect just Democrats. That's balderdash. My state of Vermont has probably the most open voting, the most accessible voting of any state in the Union. We also have one of the highest turnouts of any state in the Union. Anybody can request an absentee ballot. Anybody can vote right up to the last minute. And is this for partisanship? I look at the last election, a little over a year ago. We elected our governor and our lieutenant governor separately. Voters all came to the polls in a record turnout. They elected a Republican as governor and a Democrat as lieutenant governor. I think the Republican who was elected is proud of the way we vote. And I know the lieutenant governor who was elected, she is proud of the way we vote, because it reflected that the voters actually vote for who they want, not on some partisan way. And Madam President, we hurt this country, and we hurt this Senate that I love if we're afraid to vote. I'm proud to be the dean of the Senate. I'm proud to be the president pro tem. But I'm not proud when we don't vote. I'm not proud when we hide behind mechanisms so we don't vote. I'm not proud to see partisan voting on nominees, something that has blocked, something where there's been far more votes against women in our Senate Judiciary Committee than I've seen in the decades I've served on that committee. We can't do this. Stand up and vote. Let people know where you stand. If it's your automatic thing to vote against women for nominations, I disagree with that, but have the courage to stand up and vote and show people where you are. That's what we have to do. If people are afraid to vote, if people have their votes heard, their votes recorded, they don't belong in the U.S. Senate. Not in a body that should be the conscience of the nation. So, Madam President, I hope that we will come together. Vote these bills, these voting rights bills, up or down. In this country, we've seen too many times in the past where people were not allowed to vote or were blocked from voting for whatever way it was done. And think of every time that happened, our country suffered. Our country suffered. What we're saying is let everybody vote. Whether Republicans, Democrats, or Independents, stand up and vote. Have the ability to vote. Don't use artificial ways to block people from voting just because you think they may vote differently than you do. Just as I have fought all my career to make sure in my own state of Vermont, everybody has a chance to vote. Marcel and I have even done ads on our television saying, we want everybody to vote, whether you're voting for a Republican or voting for a Democrat. Get out and vote. Of course, I was hoping they'd vote for me. And I'm sure my Republican opponents hope they'd vote for them. But the point I was trying to make is it's important that everybody votes, whether they're voting for me or against me. And that's why in Vermont, we have one of the highest percentage of voters. And if we want to keep having these suppression of vote bills, we all suffer. The country suffers. Our image around the world suffers. Don't be afraid to vote. We're not going to get perfect people every time, but we can have a perfect way of voting. In the long run, the country is better off. Madam President, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
Madam President, my thoughts and prayers and condolences.
Can you suspend, please? We're in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without
Sorry about that.
objection.
So, Madam President, today my thoughts my prayers, our condolences are with everyone whose lives were ripped apart because of the awful fire in the apartments that ignited yesterday at the Twin Parks Northwest Tower in the Bronx. 17 people lost their lives in yesterday's fire, including 8 innocent children. Dozens of others were injured, many of them critically so. We pray for their recovery. Many are still in the ICU. It was the deadliest fire in New York City in the last 30 years, an unspeakable tragedy made 1,000 times worse because it happened within the confines of people's own homes, places that should be safe, should be secure, should be shielded from moments of terror like the ones we saw yesterday. I grieve for all the families, friends, and neighbors whose lives were suddenly cut short in the fire. Many were from immigrant families, people who came to our city to start climbing up the ladders of prosperity and a decent life for themselves and their children in this beautiful country, and now they're lost. I commend the brave firefighters who stepped up to beat back the fire, save lives, and keep the surrounding community safe. They did not think about their own safety. They just answered the call and did their jobs. That's what firefighters do. We respect them, we love them. And I'm profoundly grateful. I'm grateful for them and all the workers who are rebuilding from the damage, as well as the health workers tending to the injured. Last night, I joined with the governor, with Mayor Adams, and with other members of the city and local governments. It was a broad group because New York always pulls together in times of tragedy. And we had people from all parts of the city and all different backgrounds coming together to support those families impacted by the fire. At the federal level, we will do whatever we can: housing assistance, disaster assistance, and help for all immigrant families. Many of those affected by the fire came from Gambia and other West African countries on a program called Diversity Visas, which I was proud to author. I say to these immigrant families, do not hesitate to reach out to local and federal authorities. You will find nothing but a helping hand. When tragedy strikes our city, New Yorkers come together. We embrace one another. We help however we can. And we always find ways to come back stronger than before. That's been true throughout our city's history, and it shall remain true as we get through this latest awful tragedy. Now on defending democracy. Madam President, last week the nation observed the one-year anniversary of the greatest violent assault against our democracy since the time of the American Civil War. Though the Capitol attack of January 6, 2021 was confined to a single day, the attacks on our democracy have not ceased. The big lie, the terrible fantasy that our elections are rife with voter fraud and that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, lives on to this day and is spreading throughout our country, used to undermine our democracy. Donald Trump has such an infantile ego, he cannot accept that he lost, so he spreads the big lie. But just as bad, or almost as bad, are all those in politics, in the media, and elsewhere who know it is a lie, but continue to spread it, to the grave detriment of the fundamental roots of this country, its democracy. Tomorrow, President Biden will travel to Georgia and make the moral case to the nation that the time has come to act to defend democracy and protect voting rights, even if it means changing Senate rules to restore the Senate. Every single lover of democracy across America, especially those of us in this chamber, should take heart of the President's message and ask ourselves, what can we do to protect free and fair elections in this country? The Senate, I believe, stands ready to follow through on the President's call. Later this week, we will hold a vote yet again on legislation to protect our democracy and protect the sacred right to vote. Everyone in this chamber will have a chance to go on record. Will Republicans join Democrats in a bipartisan manner to move forward on defending democracy? Or will they once again mount a filibuster and offer their implicit endorsement of the big lie? I hope they join us, but to date, unfortunately, I have seen precious little suggesting they will do so. On the contrary, our Republican colleagues have gone to great lengths recently to distract from the dangers of Donald Trump's big lie. Senate Republicans are so stung by our arguments about voter fraud and the big lie that the Republican leader has actually tried to argue that it's actually Democrats pushing a big lie when we warn about voter suppression. The threats of voter suppression are not false, they are dangerous. The leader's line of argument, the Republican leader's line of argument, is gaslighting, pure and simple. The Republican leader has pointedly repeated to the experience of the 2020 election as proof somehow that there exists no effort to suppress the vote. But he ignores that the problem today is not just about what happened during the 2020 election, it's about what's happened after and is happening today. If Leader McConnell doesn't want to get into specifics about the laws passed by Republican legislators across this country to limit the right to vote, then we Democrats will. Despite the fact that the 2020 election was free, fair, and accurate, in the year that followed, at least 19 states suddenly decided to rewrite the rules that govern the way people vote in their respective states. At least 33 new laws have passed across the country that will make it harder to vote, harder to register to vote, and worst of all, potentially empower partisans to arbitrate outcomes of future elections instead of nonpartisan election workers. And that may be just the beginning, because legislatures in various states are preparing new laws as they enter the 2022 sessions of their legislatures. I ask my Republican colleagues, take a look at what's happened in many of the Republican-led state legislatures. When Republicans in states like Texas reduce polling hours and polling locations, how does that not make it harder for people to vote? When Republicans in states like Florida, Kansas, Iowa, and Texas make it harder for people to even register to vote, how is that not suppressing their fundamental right to vote at all? What does that have to do with election security? When Republicans in states like Georgia, Indiana, and Florida cut back on the number and availability of locations where people can drop off their absentee ballots, how can Republicans say that voting hasn't been made harder? And when Republicans in states like Georgia make it a crime to give food and water to people waiting in line at the polls, how is that not making it harder for them to cast a ballot? Some of the examples are especially egregious. According to one recent report, Lincoln County in Georgia is looking to eliminate all but one polling location in the entire county before the next election. One location in a whole big county. That is disgusting. Some voters who live in the county would have to drive 23 miles just to drop off a ballot. This in no way makes voting more convenient. It makes it an enormous burden. Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. It's a slow-motion insurrection, but a very, very pernicious one. We have yet to hear on substance any serious attempt from Senate Republicans defending these terrible new laws. They don't mention them. The truth is, our Republican colleagues cannot defend them because the goal of these laws is very clear. They are deliberately targeting all the ways that younger, poorer, and non-white Americans typically access the ballot. And by blocking this chamber from taking any action, Senate Republicans are implicitly offering their own endorsement of the big lie. Senate Democrats have been clear of our intentions from the start. The Senate must pass legislation that will safeguard our democracy, protect people's right to vote. It's why we have pushed the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act numerous times here on the floor, only for Republicans to filibuster them and prevent the chamber from having so much as a debate. By hijacking the rules of the Senate and preventing any movement, Republicans are saying they oppose policies that guarantee same-day voter registration, policies that safeguard against election subversion, policies that protect poll workers, and policies that prevent faulty and dangerous voter roll purges. By blocking action in the Senate, Republicans are saying they oppose efforts to fight the power of dark money and efforts to end partisan gerrymandering. Senate Republicans are saying they're perfectly fine with laws that limit voter registration, limit early voting, limit the number of polling places and drop boxes. They're even fine with policies that criminalize giving food and drink to voters at the polls. These laws are anathema to the very spirit of our democracy. They are Jim Crow too, and it is the Republican Party, by and large in this Senate, supporting the reenactment of those Jim Crow laws. And if Republicans refuse to join us in a bipartisan spirit, if they continue to hijack the rules of the Senate to turn this chamber into a deep freezer, we're going to consider the appropriate steps necessary to restore the Senate so we can pass these proposals and send them to the President's desk. On this month, the same month we mark the one-year anniversary of an armed insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, the question before the Senate is a simple one. How will we find a path forward on protecting our freedoms in the 21st century? Members of this body must now face a choice. They can follow in the footsteps of our patriotic predecessors in this chamber, or they can sit by as the fabric of our democracy unravels before their very eyes. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Republican leader.
This week on this floor, we're poised to witness something that has never happened before in living memory. An attempt to attack the core identity of the Senate by a sitting majority leader. The senior senator from New York once said nuking the filibuster would, quote, turn what the founding fathers called the cooling saucer of democracy into the rubber stamp of dictatorship. He said it would make the country into a banana republic, a doomsday for democracy, he said. Now he wants to trigger that doomsday himself. When I was majority leader, some of my own party urged me to break the Senate for our own party's short-term gain. My answer was a simple word, no. Less than 4 years ago, the senior senator from Illinois said nuking the legislative filibuster, quote, would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised and created, going back to our founding fathers. Now he wants the Senate to end on his watch. The last time Senate Democrats were in the minority, 32 of them signed a letter demanding the legislative filibuster stay in place. Now many of them say they want to break this institution. The excuses put forward for this behavior are entirely fake. The supposed justifications are simply false. The Senate Democratic leaders are trying to use a big lie to bully and berate their own members into breaking their word, breaking the rules, and breaking the Senate. We're going to spend all week sounding the alarm on the radical takeovers that some Democrats want to pull off. They want to silence millions of Americans and take over the Senate so they can take over elections, so they can take over America. Leading Democrats say they want to break the Senate because of a sinister anti-voting plot that is sweeping America. Of course, this is totally fake. It does not exist. The current control of Congress and the White House were decided in 2020 by the highest turnout in 120 years. 94% of voters said voting was easy. More Americans say current voting laws are too lax than say they are too restrictive. Confronted by the facts, the Democratic leader says they're, of course, irrelevant. He says the entire nuclear push is occasioned by what a few states did in 2021. This is utter nonsense. The senator from New York has been publicly laying groundwork to nuke the Senate rules since back in 2019, before the 2020 election. More than a year before the 2020 election, the Democratic leader was openly flirting with nuking the Senate rules if he got the power, so he'd be able to ram through bigger changes. Now, none of this was occasioned by what state legislatures did in 2021. This is actually a years-long quest for power in search of a pretext. And their hysterical attacks on state laws are fake as well. The state of Georgia passed a voting law providing for more in-person early voting than New York provides. It allows for no excuse absentee voting, which New York prohibits. If there was not a voting crisis in Democratic-run New York 6 months ago, there's no crisis in Georgia now. If Georgia is a banana republic today, then New York has been and still is a banana republic. There's zero logic here, zero consistency. In the state of Texas, Democrats are hysterical because the state rolled back some unusual COVID-specific exceptions to their prior procedures, such as universal drive-through voting and 24-hour voting. So if the bar for voting rights now requires the possibility of voting in person at 3 a.m., how many blue states in America meet that bar? Neither of these things existed in Texas before 2020, and neither widely exists in blue states. Every hysterical claim that our democracy is in crisis rings hollow. More Americans today say that President Biden's election was legitimate, now listen to this, than said the same thing about the prior president in late 2017. More Americans today say that President Biden's election was legitimate than said the same about the prior president in late 2017. Yet, Democrats are trying to use their fake hysteria to justify breaking Senate rules so they can seize control of elections in all 50 states. That's what they're up to. Historically, the Senate has taken up elections legislation on a careful, bipartisan basis. We've made sure not to trample on the rights of voters and the proper roles of local officials. In 2002, we passed the Help America Vote Act by a vote of 92 to 2. 92 to 2. Chris Dodd and I authored that bill. Interestingly enough, the only dissenting votes came from then Senator Hillary Clinton and current Democratic leader Chuck Schumer. 92 to 2. Well, that's how you pass election reform if there are actual issues that need tackling. You do it carefully, you do it thoughtfully. Bipartisan committee work, regular order. Our colleagues aren't doing anything like that. They're trying to ram through sweeping partisan legislation that they first drafted and introduced in its first iteration back in 2019. Democrats say they're concerned about efforts to disempower the appropriate local elections officials. Well, it's actually their bills that would disempower local officials by Washington Democrats appointing themselves the entire country's Board of Elections on steroids. Democrats say they're concerned about overturning election results. Well, it's their bills that would overturn election results, overruling the common sense voting laws that citizens across the country have picked for their own states. A case in point. The Democrats' latest bill would force the entire country to adopt two practices, same-day registration and no-excuse absentee voting, that the citizens of New York State had as ballot measures last November. New York, deep blue New York, rejected them both. So you got to ask yourself, why are Washington Democrats refusing to accept the decision of New York voters? Why are they trying to set aside these election results and overturn the people's will? Our Democratic colleagues have also talked about a so-called voting rights bill. This is a bill to turn the partisan Attorney General into a national elections czar. The Attorney General would no longer have to sue states and win in court. He could end up doing an end run around the legal system and push states around without having to persuade a judge first. So, I'm sure our Democratic colleagues would have reacted well if Republicans had tried to break Senate rules so that Bill Barr could micromanage elections in blue states. I'm sure that would have gone swimmingly on their side of the aisle. But ultimately, Madam President, the issue at stake this week run even deeper than this fake hysteria, even deeper than voting laws. Breaking the Senate itself and nuking the filibuster would cause a massive political power outage for many millions of American citizens, for entire states. So the filibuster is not just about what bills are blocked, it's also the sole feature that gives millions of Americans any voice at all in the legislation that does pass whenever there is one-party control. Annual appropriations, government funding bills, the NDAA, rescue packages like the CARES Act, all of could be done on a one-party basis, thereby eliminating the influence of every state in America represented by a member of the minority. For decades, both senators and citizens have been able to take for granted that everybody gets a voice, even when they don't have divided government. If this unique feature of the Senate is blown up, millions and millions of Americans' voices will cease to be heard in this chamber. A radical Senate takeover for a radical elections takeover, for a radical takeover of our nation's future. What the Democratic leader wants to do would not protect our democracy or our system of government. It would destroy a key feature of American government forever. And senators on both sides know it.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
Madam President, I listened carefully to the Republican leader's statement about the institutions of the Senate, the traditions of the Senate, the rules of the Senate, the precedents of the Senate, and why we are duty-bound to follow them. But I couldn't get this image out of my mind as he spoke. The image of that news that came to us one day that Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia had tragically passed away. And we all remember what happened next. It was the same Republican leader who sent the word out to his Republican members, don't even entertain the possibility that President Obama is going to fill this vacancy on the Supreme Court. We're going to keep this vacancy open in the hopes that we can elect a Republican president to fill it. Now that was 8 months at least, maybe 10 months before the election. And it was the first time in the history of the United States that a Republican leader of the Senate used his power to browbeat his members, not even to meet with Merrick Garland, the president's nominee, President Obama's nominee. They wouldn't even entertain an office meeting with him to discuss it. It was out of the question. The Supreme Court was going to have 8 members and period, not one more, because there was an election coming and a Republican opportunity in that election. And so that's what happened. You remember it well, and I do too. So when I hear about preserving the sanctity of traditions in the Senate, I can't help but remember that vacant seat on the Supreme Court for almost a year. I cannot help but remember that in the last year of Obama's presidency, that he was denied the opportunity which other presidents routinely were given to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. That was the reality. And now there's a question of the future of the filibuster, and I will concede that the filibuster has been part of the profile of the Senate for a long, long time, for many decades. But what the Senate Republican leader fails to note is that the use of the filibuster is out of control. We now have filibusters threatened on everything in sight. It was by design, not by accident. And it was by design to slow down the business of the Senate and to stop the production of the Senate. And that's why day after weary day, this chamber is empty. Nothing's happening. Because a filibuster is usually looming over the body. And for those who want to restore the Senate to an actual legislative body with actual debate and amendments on the floor, we're being told by the Republican leader that we are somehow denying the basic birthright of the Senate. And we know that is wrong. We know that the Senate, as many of us remember it, has changed dramatically. It was 25 years ago that I came to the Senate. We voted a lot. We actually had 12 appropriation bills come to the floor of the Senate every year, under an open process where any amendment could be offered and debated and voted on. And ultimately, that appropriation bill would go into conference with the House and end up doing what it was supposed to do, funding our government. I can't remember the last time that happened. I think it's been 10 years now since the subcommittees of appropriations did their normal business with a budget resolution and prepared these bills. It's gone. Why? Why is it gone? Wasn't it the tradition of the Senate that you consider those bills? It's gone because of an abuse of the filibuster. Any amendment that is offered is threatened with a 60-vote requirement. and things grind to a halt. And you know the net result of it? We have something called an omnibus. We put all the spending bills into one massive piece of legislation, let the staff write it, let the members look over their shoulder and see if there's anything in there of interest, and we pass it year after year after year. Is that another fine tradition of the Senate that we want to protect? I hope not. I hope the senator from Kentucky realizes it. Let me say a word about voting, if I can. For as long as we've had this nation, there's always been a basic question as to who will choose the leaders. Our founding fathers showed a lot of wisdom, but they missed it when it came to voting, at least by this century's standards, because they denied the vote to African Americans, who were by and large slaves in that culture, and they denied the vote to women. And they said that basically propertied individuals were the ones who would choose the leaders of our country. We have a different view of America's democracy today. And many of us believe that every eligible person in this country should be given an opportunity to vote that is not a hardship. So in the 2020 election, we had a record turnout, and there were many of us who felt we should build on that to have an even larger turnout in the next election. Let the people speak, let the people vote. And in about 20 different state legislatures controlled by the Republicans, exactly the opposite was decided. They decided that they would restrict opportunities to vote. Too many darn people voted in a 2020 election, and the results weren't what some of the Republican legislators and governors expected. So they've decided they want to change it. Reduce the opportunity for early voting, reduce the opportunities for registration, reduce the opportunities for same-day registration. They argue that some states have and some don't. Well, the bottom line, as we see it on the Democratic side, is if we're going to open opportunity for people across the country who are eligible to vote without hardship, then we ought to do it across the board, and that's why we support legislation, federal legislation, ordained and envisioned by our Constitution to establish standards that will make it easier to vote. The senator from Kentucky likes to come to the floor and say, well, New York doesn't have all those good things. He may be right. Why shouldn't they? As far as I'm concerned, Illinois, New York, Hawaii, all states should be governed by standards that give people an additional opportunity to vote. I would rather come down on the side of a larger turnout of the electorate and let democracy speak than the alternative, which is being suggested by the Republican leader. They want to selectively make it difficult for some people to come and vote. I don't. I think they're wrong. Time and again, the Republican leader came to the floor and called things fake. I guess we're now into that characterization and can thank President Trump for leading us down that path. What is not fake is this. Throughout the history of the United States, the opportunity to vote has been denied primarily to people of color and the poor year after year in an effort to try to make sure that election results turned out a certain way. For the longest time, my Democratic Party was guilty of that sin. I readily confess it because history makes it clear. But now that mantle has been passed to the party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party, which is now trying to restrict the right to vote across the nation. When you heard the probably suggestion in Georgia, you couldn't provide water or food to people waiting in line, it probably struck most Americans as odd. Why would they say that? Well, visualize, if you will, the lines of voters. And you will find, if your memory is the same as mine, that largely they were minority voters who were standing in line for hours to vote. And so the Georgia State Legislature and others have said, if you give them water or food, you've violated the law. Let them stand in line without any support. Really? Is that what it's come down to? The fear that if you gave a cup of water to someone waiting in line to vote, you were buying their vote? I just can't believe the thinking that leads us to that. But we know behind it were a lot of situations where machinery and voting places were limited to minority populations. Madam President, I'd like to speak on a separate topic at this point, ask that it be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, nearly 32 years ago, Lithuania, a tiny nation on the Baltic Sea, dared to reclaim its freedom from the Soviet Union. At that time, the Soviet Union was one of the world's superpowers. The reaction from Moscow took 11 months, and it was brutal. On January 11th, 1991, 31 years ago this week, Soviet tanks rolled in to crush Lithuanian freedom. It would become known as Lithuania's Bloody Sunday. In the capital city of Vilnius, crowds gathered at the TV Tower and Parliament Square to protest the resistance of the Russians and to defend their new independent national legislature. I was lucky. I was there to see the efforts by the people of Lithuania, this tiny nation, to protect what they were starting with a new parliament and free elections for the first time in almost 50 years. 13 martyrs died in the Soviet Union's brutal attempt to crush the restoration of Lithuanian independence. But to the astonishment of the entire world, after 2 days of bloodshed and killing, the Soviet tanks turned around and left. Against all odds, that tiny nation of Lithuania threw off 50 years of Soviet tyranny and occupation. They soon were joined by Latvia and Estonia, where similar courage was shown, and then by other Eastern European nations held captive by the Soviet bloc. Today, I'm proud to say Lithuania remains a free and independent democracy. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, at the time he ordered the tanks to withdraw from Lithuania 31 years ago, came to realize that you can brutalize a people who are determined to be free, but you can't defeat them. Ultimately, freedom will prevail. It's a tragedy that Russian President Putin, Vladimir Putin, cannot or will not learn that lesson of history. Instead, today, he is intimidating Ukraine with the same discredited tactics that failed in the Baltics 3 decades ago. Madam President, I was fortunate to be invited on a trip in the year 2014 with the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. He never missed visiting the hotspots in the world. And we went to Kyiv in Ukraine and walked down to the Maidan Square, which had been the place where the people of Ukraine had stepped forward to demand their freedom. Senator McCain invited me to be part of that delegation during the extraordinary moment when the Ukrainian people were preparing to risk their lives for freedom. We were joined on our trip to Kyiv by Senators Barrasso, Johnson, Murphy, and others. We walked somberly through the makeshift shrines set up in the Maidan, memorializing those who'd lost their lives in Ukraine's peaceful protest for a better future. They stopped us at one point and pointed to a place and said, one of the protesters was standing here when the government sniper killed him. That's why there were flowers and candles at that site. We were planning to travel to eastern part of the country as well, but we were too late. Russians and Vladimir Putin had already invaded with their little green men and had seized the territory of Crimea. Yet in the ensuing years, despite Russia's military invasion and occupation of eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian people have thrived and built on their democratic aspirations. As with any democracy, there's always area of improvement, but the Ukrainian people have clearly decided their future is with the community of democracies and not with Moscow. And yet that basic human desire to be free and democratically choose one's leaders is apparently too much for Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who is now threatening a further massive military invasion of Ukraine. He's amassed some 100,000 troops on their border, preparing for that invasion. It's not enough that Putin denies the Russian people their basic freedom. He's determined to eradicate similar aspirations on Russia's border to protect his undemocratic regime. President Biden and members of both parties in this chamber have been swift to condemn Putin's threatened further invasion of Ukraine. President Biden has made it clear that any such move by Russia will be met with rapid and severe economic sanctions. The chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez of New Jersey, has drafted legislation that would impose historic sanctions if Russia further invades Ukraine. The bill's approach is sweeping and clear, and I support it. I agree with our president and the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. This is the right message for us to send from President and the United States Senate to Vladimir Putin. Chairman Menendez's solution also provides assistance to the Baltic states in standing up to both Putin and China. A timely measure I want to thank my colleague for including in this bill. It's the bill we should actually be debating on the Senate floor. Instead, we will be forced to vote this week or soon on a different and weaker response to the crisis on Ukraine's border. The junior senator from Texas is the author of this weaker approach. He's managed to force a vote on it by holding hostage dozens of President Biden's nominations. His approach includes a provision to remove the waiver for sanctions against a new gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. Let me be clear, this Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a proposal I've been critical of for a long time. I've urged our European allies to diversify their natural gas supply away from Russia. President Biden's position on Nord Stream 2 is the same, that the pipeline could effectively undermine European security by increased reliance on Moscow. But the truth is, construction on that pipeline did not begin in the last year. It started under President Trump. I don't think you'll be hearing that, President, in the speeches of the junior senator from Texas. Despite congressional sanctions and restrictions, by the time Biden entered office, that pipeline was 95% complete. Where was the Republican outrage when the lion's share of the pipeline was built under the Trump administration? Were dozens of critical nominations brazenly and dangerously held then? No. Given the pipeline's near completion this spring, President Biden waived some, but not all, sanctions on Nord Stream 2 in an effort to mend relations with Germany and its new government. They're one of our closest allies and partners. We need to continue such close cooperation with our European partners so long as they stand with us to effectively deter further Russian provocation. And President Biden announced an agreement with Germany that involves securing Ukraine and Europe's energy sector, as well as imposing sanctions on Russia. This is important. The president still has the authority to impose additional sanctions in Nord Stream 2. And in fact, just this November, the administration sanctioned a Russian-linked ship in connection with it. The bill offered by my colleague from Texas does not provide any new authority to the president. It only takes away his waiver authority to force sanctions, setting a dangerous precedent and jeopardizing the administration's flexibility to respond to escalation by the Russians. This cruise bill will hardly deter the potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, only serve to complicate the efforts to repair relations with our European ally Germany, which has critical energy needs. I believe we should leave the flexibility of how and when to further sanction this pipeline to the president as part of a larger approach in dealing with Putin. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to support the wiser approach by the senior senator from New Jersey to send a serious, credible response to Russia if it further invades Ukraine. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
We'll call the roll.
Mr. President,
Senator Holt,
Madam President,
hold your notice of absence of a quorum. Can you hold that notice, please?
I withdraw it.
Senator from Iowa.
for over 25 years in the Senate, I've been an advocate for adoption. Adoption is a way for families to be created out of tragedy. It's a pathway to the joy of raising children and guaranteeing security of a place that now they can call home. One family, Kate and Ben Bryan from Iowa, made the choice to open their hearts and their home to a child from China and were matched with a little girl named Rosie. Hundreds of families across the country, including the Bryans and others in Iowa, have chosen adoption from China. They've been matched with specific children and made arrangements to welcome those children into their homes. Many of these kids being adopted from China have disabilities or other special needs and require specialized health and care services. These kids are in desperate need of families to take care of them, but are being denied the opportunity to come to their home in America with those parents, all due to China's refusal to let Americans into the country to complete adoptions. In February of 2020, China closed its border due to the spread of COVID. This meant that parents who had already been matched with a child in China could not proceed with their adoptions. And of course, parents must physically be present in China to continue the adoption process, bring it to finality in order to get their child home. What was said to be a temporary emergency precaution because of COVID has now stretched into years, despite the availability of vaccines. Due to China's unwillingness to open its borders to these parents, adoptions have been stalled for now 2 years. Some parents have been prohibited from even communicating with their children during this time. The Bryans from Iowa are unable to receive updated health information about their daughter and are unable to send letters or care packages. She might not even know that they've been trying for years to bring Rosie into their family. Now, other countries that participate in international adoptions have found ways to continue the process even in light of COVID. Even countries with travel restrictions or other groups have made exceptions for adoptive families. Parents want to cooperate. Parents are willing to quarantine. Parents are willing to be tested. Parents will take every precaution asked of them by China. Now, what's so odd about all the parents that want to adopt not being allowed into China? We know that China has opened the country to athletes participating in the Olympics, those wishing to do business there, and to American journalists. But why not to adopting parents? Tourist visas are still not being issued, and adopted parents are being classified as tourists despite specific reasons for their visit. It's imperative that the Biden administration work to get adoptions from China moving again. These families have been waiting long enough. The kids that they're working to adopt have been waiting even longer. I get a chance to hear from kids in foster care in the United States through my role as chairman of the Senate Caucus on Foster Youth. I always hear the same message from these young people. They want a mom and dad. They want a loving place to call home. Kids in China are no different. They deserve a family and safety and security of loving parents. I pray that the hearts of Chinese leaders are softened enough to allow these families into their country and allow these kids to come home to America. Now, on another subject, and the subject of this week in the United States Senate about whether the 60 vote requirement to move legislation ahead should be done away with. That is the purpose of coming to the Senate for these remarks. Senate procedure is complex enough that talking about it often trips up even senators who have been around here for several years. Reporters writing about the so-called filibuster often looked to past reporting to get their bearings. In doing so, they perpetuate a conventional wisdom that is false or even misleading. It is common around here to refer to the cloture motion as the Senate filibuster. I want all my colleagues to know that I'm guilty of doing this sort of shorthand all the time, and I tell myself I ought to not be making this same mistake. According to the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, quote, filibustering includes any use of dilatory or obstructive tactics to block a measure by preventing it from coming to a vote, end of quote. The cloture motion is not the same thing as a filibuster, as the Congressional Research Service will also confirm. The cloture vote requires 60 votes to bring consideration of legislation to finality. That means not just debate, but crucially, the amending process. And of course, I want to repeat that. The effect of invoking cloture is not to say that the Senate has considered the bill enough, meaning a sufficient number of amendments have been considered that the Senate has a chance to work its collective will. The Senate was designed by the constitutional framers to be a deliberative body. In the House, a narrow majority can pass hastily drafted, poorly conceived legislation. As political parties have become more ideologically polarized, power to shape legislation has accrued to the House leadership. Individual members of the House of Representatives have essentially no opportunity to get a vote on bills or amendments unless blessed by the Speaker of the House, Republican or Democrat. The House Rules Committee, filled with partisans loyal to the Speaker, will draft a very special rule for considering a specific bill, and that's possible to detail the number of amendments, if any, allowed to be offered. Members of the majority party in the House are expected to vote for their party's rule no matter what. The Senate is supposed to be different. It's kind of like what we call the cooling saucer, making sure each provision in legislation is thought through and done as well as we can, particularly to overcome some of the House of Representatives that acts so quickly. We also make sure that bills work for most states, not just the most populous state on the East or West Coast that tend to dominate the House of Representatives. So the Senate is different. Each and every senator represents a whole state, and each senator has equal right to participate in the legislative process on behalf of their state. Senators who would abdicate that right are doing a disservice to their state and the people they represent. In the 2008 election, Democrats gained a 60-vote supermajority in the Senate with a Democrat House and President Obama. As such, the Senate during those 2 years tended to act kind of like the House does on process. The usual deliberative process with bipartisan negotiations and carefully refining and tweaking by committees all went out the window. Major legislation was drafted in the Senate Democrat leader's office often bypassing Senate committees. Democrats would then dutifully invoke cloture, often with no Senate floor amendment process at all. So naturally, those of us that have served around the Senate a while were astounded at the time that Democrat senators would routinely vote to cut off amendment process before it began. Surely they had amendments important to their states that they would like to have offered, but voting for cloture was expected of Democrats. They had 60 votes after all. They could do almost anything they wanted to. And it turned out just like the rule that comes out of the Rules Committee affecting how debate happens in the House of Representatives. Now, Democrats did this even if it meant giving up their right to offer amendments, thus abdicating their responsibility to represent their home states. That situation became the norm, even when the Democrats lost short-lived 60-vote supermajority. Most senators now serving only know the Senate since this break with Senate tradition. Despite some improvements in recent years, the culture of the Senate has not recovered. When people say the Senate is broken, the problem is not the one Senate rule keeping it from becoming just like the House of Representatives. In other words, it's not the 60-vote requirement that has broken the Senate. The problem is that people who expect the Senate to act just like the House of Representatives when the Senate is actually intended to be a check on the House. Since the most significant effect of blowing up the 60-vote cloture rule would be denied the right of all senators to offer amendments on the Senate floor, why do people still talk about some return to the mythical talking filibuster? That comes out of confusion over the word filibuster that I mentioned at the start of my remarks today. The Senate rules state that in most cases during debate on a bill, a senator may speak for as long as that senator holds the floor. That's the rule Jimmy Stewart's character took advantage of to delay consideration of a corrupt bill in the classic movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That meets the definition of a filibuster, but it has nothing to do with the cloture rule. Those who would argue that senators ought to have to speak nonstop on the Senate floor until they collapse just to preserve their right to offer an amendment on behalf of their state are either confused or being dishonest. During the Trump administration, reporters routinely sprinkled the word falsely into descriptions of things that President Trump said as sort of a running fact check. Reporters ought to revive the practice of using the word falsely when President Biden and other Democrats make demonstrably false statements. This issue, of course, would be a good place to start, and do it this week. Any reference to some non-existent, totally mythical age of the talking filibuster ought to have a disclaimer that no such requirement ever existed for a 60-vote cloture rule. As I mentioned, conventional wisdom about the filibuster has been distorted by confusion and perhaps intentional shell games. For senators or reporters to truly understand this issue, I urge you to consult the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service as your main source. And on my last topic, Madam President, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has once famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest geopolitical
The yeas are 64, the nays are 30. The motion is agreed to.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I understand there are 18 bills at the desk, and I ask for their first reading en bloc.
The clerk will read the titles of the bills for the first time en bloc.
S3452, a bill to ensure that state and local enforcement may cooperate with federal officials and so forth. S3453, a bill to prohibit the payment of certain legal statements to individuals who unlawfully entered the United States. S3454, a bill to clarify the rights of Indians and Indian tribes and so forth. S3455, a bill to prohibit the implementation of new requirements to report bank account deposits and withdrawals. S3456, a bill to enact the definition of waters of the United States and so forth and for other purposes. S3457, a bill to codify the temporary scheduling order for fentanyl-related substances and so forth. S3458, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code and so forth. S3459, a bill to prohibit a federal agency from promulgating any rule or guidance and so forth and for other purposes. S3460, a bill to prohibit local educational agencies from obligating certain federal funds and so forth. S3461, a bill to provide that the rules submitted by the Department of Labor relating to COVID-19 vaccination and testing shall have no force or effect and for other purposes. S3462, a bill to require U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to take into custody certain aliens and so forth and for other purposes. S3463, a bill to impose sanctions and other measures in response to the failure of the government of the People's Republic of China to allow an investigation and so forth. S3464, a bill to preserve and protect the free choice of individual employees and so forth. S3465, a bill to clarify the treatment of two or more employers as joint employers and so forth. S3466, a bill to prohibit the use of federal funds for the production of programs and so forth and for other purposes. S3467, a bill to withhold United States contributions to the United Nations and so forth and for other purposes. S3468, a bill to provide for a limitation on the removal of the government of Cuba and so forth. S3469, a bill to establish a review of United States multilateral aid.
Is that it? Madam President,
Majority Leader.
I now ask for a second reading, and I object to my own request, all en bloc.
Objection having been heard. The bills will receive their second reading on the next legislative day.
Now, Madam President, a few moments ago, I went through the typical Rule 14 process, which the Majority Leader always does, to place legislation from both minority and majority on the legislative calendar. It's merely technical. Now, the Republican leader seems to want to place a bunch of gotcha bills on the legislative calendar that he thinks would be tough votes for Democrats to take as some kind of payback for pursuing legislation to protect the sacred right to vote. Well, we Democrats aren't afraid of these votes. So what I propose to the Republican leader is that the Senate hold up or down votes at a majority threshold on each of the Republican bills he has outlined tonight, as well as the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Let me say again, in a few moments, I'll ask unanimous consent to have the Senate vote on the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and all the so-called tough bills the Republican leader is proposing tonight at a majority threshold. We believe the right to vote, to protect our democracy, to get rid of dark money from elections, to end gerrymandering to assure the American people pick their elected leaders, not politicians, is so important, I'd hope the Republican leader would go along with this proposal. Our caucus strongly disagrees with the Republican bills on this list, but for the sake of our democracy and getting to a majority vote on voting rights, we are willing to vote. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Republican leader, that the Senate vote on passage of the following bills in the order listed, that there be no motions or amendments in order to the bills, and that the passage be at a majority threshold, all without intervening action or debate. S. 2747, the Freedom to Vote Act. H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. S. 3452, 3453. Do I have to read the S's? Okay. S. 3452, S. 3453, S. 3454, S. 3455, S. 3456, S. 3457, S. 3458, S. 3459, S. 3460, S. 3461, S. 3462, S. 3463, S. 3464, S. 3465, S. 3466, S. 3467, S. 3468, and S. 3469.
Is there objection?
Object.
Objection is heard.
Now, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Banking Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 450 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S. 450, a bill to award posthumously the Congressional Gold Medal to Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley.
Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the Burr substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 3451, introduced earlier today.
Will report.
S. 3451, a bill to include certain computer-related projects in the federal permitting program under and so forth and further purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res. 486, submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S. Res. 486, recognizing Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Day on December 14, 2021.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, finally, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today at recess until 11 a.m., Tuesday, January 11th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the Journal of Proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. That upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Davidson nomination post-cloture. That the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. Further, that all post-cloture time on the Davidson nomination expire at 2:20 p.m. and that the Senate vote on confirmation of the nomination. Finally, that if any nominations are confirmed during today's session, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand in recess under the previous order.
The Senate stands in recess until 11 a.m. tomorrow.